So King Charles III intentionally waited until Meghan Markle's 45th birthday to drop the absolute legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear bomb directly onto his own son. And honestly, the sheer level of meticulous planning involved here is either deeply terrifying or wildly impressive, depending entirely on which side of the fractured family you happen to be looking at. Because while absolutely everyone on the internet was obsessively watching the Duchess of Sussex cut a lavish cake in Montecito, and endlessly debating whether her lifestyle brand launch was strategically delayed yet again, the actual grinding machinery of the ancient monarchy was quietly executing something that makes all the tell-all memoir drama and breathless Netflix specials look like petty playground stuff. This isn't just another tiresome story about who said what to whom at a fitting, or whether someone made someone else cry right before a royal wedding. This is a story about a reigning king sitting alone at Sandringham with a silver fountain pen, systematically, ruthlessly rewriting the entire financial and legal architecture of the House of Windsor specifically to permanently wall off absolutely anyone who doesn't physically live in Britain. And the really wild, almost unbelievable part is that he successfully did it by weaponizing an emergency constitutional provision that basically nobody outside a very, very small circle of elite palace lawyers even knew still existed on the books. So let's start exactly with what actually happened, because the granular details matter immensely here, and the timeline is genuinely bonkers. In early August 2026, while the global media apparatus was completely occupied with the Duchess of Sussex's birthday coverage and all the usual predictable speculation about whether the royal family would actually acknowledge it publicly on social media, King Charles was locked away at Sandringham quietly executing something archaic called a cotisil. Now, I initially had to look this up because it honestly sounds like a fancy Italian pasta dish, but it's actually an incredibly powerful emergency constitutional mechanism that explicitly allows the reigning sovereign to unilaterally restructure vast amounts of non-crown assets entirely without going through the messy process of parliament or cabinet approval. Think of it as the strict legal equivalent of aggressively pulling a fire alarm that instantly, permanently locks absolutely every door in the building at once. It's specifically designed for extreme situations where the monarch independently determines there's an active institutional crisis that simply cannot wait for the normal, slow, deliberative process. And Charles definitively decided that August 2026 absolutely qualified as a crisis. The timing wasn't remotely accidental. Deliberately choosing a window when the ravenous news cycle was already completely saturated with Californian birthday coverage meant the dry, administrative filing would quietly land with a dull thud instead of a massive, explosive bang. Nobody was watching the dry court circular. Nobody was actively monitoring boring trust filings. Absolutely everyone was looking directly at California, which is exactly where the palace desperately wanted their attention directed while they worked. What the codicil actually functionally does is where this gets genuinely, terrifyingly fascinating from a pure legal strategy perspective. Because Charles didn't just crudely cut off access to money. He aggressively rebuilt the entire sprawling inheritance framework around a single, devastatingly precise clause. Any named beneficiary who actively maintains primary residency outside the British Isles for 5 consecutive years is now automatically permanently disqualified from accessing the core capital principle of the massive trusts originally established back in 1994. That highly specific 5-year threshold is absolutely not random. It aligns perfectly and surgically with Prince Harry's highly publicized withdrawal from active royal duties back in 2020. By the time this ironclad legal document was actually signed, Harry had been physically living in California for roughly 6 years. The math is incredibly precise. The harsh cutoff is completely retroactive in its devastating effect, even if it's technically forward-looking in its legal language. And the really clever part, if you can even call it that when a father is essentially legally disinheriting his own son, is that this specific wording transforms the whole messy situation from an emotional family dispute into a matter of objective, cold, black-letter law. There's absolutely no room left for an emotional appeal. There's zero space for negotiation. There's absolutely no desperate phone call that can possibly fix it. The trust either legally applies to you based on exactly where you live, or it doesn't. And if you chose to build a sunny life in Montecito, it doesn't. But Charles absolutely didn't stop at just the money, which is honestly where this goes from being a ruthless financial restructuring to something that starts looking exactly like a comprehensive, scorched earth legal campaign. The codicil also specifically addresses highly valuable physical property, specifically targeting items that have been culturally designated for decades as eventually belonging to the descendants of the late Princess Diana. There's one stunning piece in particular that the ruthless palace legal team apparently focused on, a priceless diamond and ruby tiara that was originally presented to Diana by a foreign head of state during a tour in the 1980s. For many years, this specific item was implicitly understood within the family dynamics to be intended for Harry's future children or grandchildren. Under the aggressive new legal framework, the palace actively reclassified this specific item as an official diplomatic gift, rather than personal inheritable property. That subtle distinction matters enormously. A diplomatic gift legally belongs to the state, absolutely not to any private individual. It gets permanently housed in the highly secure Tower of London collection. It absolutely can't be exported out of the country, inherited by relatives, or used as collateral for massive private loans. And once something officially enters the state collection under that strict classification, getting it back out is essentially legally impossible. The incredibly high legal standard for reversing that kind of airtight designation would require definitively proving the original classification was somehow fraudulent, which is absolutely not happening when the reigning sovereign himself personally signed off on it. The aggressive archive seizure is maybe even more ruthless. And I say that fully knowing how wild the tiara reclassification sounds. Buried deep within the codicil, there's a highly specific footnote that addresses the deeply personal letters written by Prince Harry during his teenage years while boarding at Eton College. These sensitive documents are currently stored in a highly secure, climate-controlled vault located deep beneath the Sandringham Library, which is already a sentence that sounds exactly like it belongs in a Gothic mystery novel, but stay with me. The document formally permanently transfers the absolute legal copyright of these formative, highly personal writings directly to the office of the Prince of Wales. Now, under strict property law, the physical owner of correspondence holds enormous, undeniable leverage, even if the original author retains certain publication rights. What this aggressive move means in harsh practice is that absolutely any future memoir, sweeping documentary, or lucrative public project that attempts to rely on descriptions of early family interactions or direct quotes from those specific letters now absolutely has to go through William's office for legal permission. The palace didn't just lock the physical vault to hide the paper, they legally locked the intellectual property rights to Harry's own teenage handwriting. That's absolutely not a financial decision, that's absolute narrative control. And it is permanent. The non-disclosure mechanism built ruthlessly into the codicil is where the trap really finally snaps shut on the Sussexes. The text explicitly, aggressively states that any legal challenge brought against this amendment by a disqualified beneficiary will automatically and instantly trigger the full public release of all highly private financial audits concerning that beneficiary's lucrative post-royal commercial ventures. So here's the impossible dilemma the California household now faces. You can quietly accept the financial restructuring in total, humiliating silence, lose access to the massive trust capital permanently, and simply move on with your life. Or you can aggressively challenge it in court, at which point every single private business deal, every lucrative partnership agreement, every revenue stream from the massive Netflix deal to the massive book advance to the highly paid speaking engagements gets completely laid out in public discovery for the tabloids to devour. The palace has essentially written a massive binding gag order directly into property law. You want to fight for the inheritance? Great. The fight itself will completely expose your entire financial operation to the world. That's absolutely not a legal strategy designed to simply win in court. That's a masterclass legal strategy designed to make absolutely sure court never happens. It's a brutal checkmate written directly in trust clauses. What makes the timing even more pointed and dramatic is that while all this was being quietly signed and sealed at Sandringham, Prince William apparently had absolutely no idea what was happening until his own access to the sovereign registries got abruptly cut off. The secure digital bridge that allows Kensington Palace and Sandringham to seamlessly coordinate estate management suddenly went completely dark from the northern end. William's frantic office started making urgent calls. Nobody answered. The king was completely isolated behind locked, closed doors with his elite legal team, and the Prince of Wales was forced to make the drastic decision to get in a helicopter and fly directly to Norfolk entirely without the standard 48 hours of advance notice or a mandatory security sweep. When he landed aggressively in driving rain and tried to physically access the upper floor of Sandringham, he shockingly discovered that his own biometric access privileges had been systematically, deliberately erased from the local system registry within the preceding 2 hours. An incredibly rare administrative warrant, issued directly by the keeper of the privy purse under the king's absolute sovereign prerogative, had completely removed him from the entry system. He angrily pressed his thumb against the glowing scanner. A red light flashed. A low electronic tone sounded, and access was firmly denied. Through the narrow glass viewing slit in the reinforced security door, William could clearly see Sir Clive Alderton, the king's senior private secretary, walking quickly down the inner corridor, carrying a locked, heavy leather dispatch case, marked with a blue customs tag indicating international diplomatic transit. When William knocked sharply and angrily on the glass, Alderton simply held up a signed royal executive order commanding total operational silence and kept walking without making eye contact. Now, I want to pause right here because this specific detail is genuinely staggering when you really think about it. The direct heir to the throne, the future King of England, was physically, humiliatingly locked out of a building he was eventually supposed to inherit, while helplessly watching the king's staff carry crucial documents past him that would permanently drastically alter the financial structure of the very institution he's destined to lead. And the exact reason he couldn't do absolutely anything about it legally is even more remarkable and ironic. William had inadvertently, accidentally signed the very mechanism that made this entire ambush possible exactly 2 years earlier during a seemingly routine estate restructuring. There was a mundane cross-lease for a block of land near Highgrove that contained a deeply hidden, highly complex subclause granting the reigning monarch the permanent right to reallocate an equivalent value of non-land assets during a family restructuring. William had carelessly signed it without scrutinizing the granular, boring fine print. That standard boring lease became the exact, powerful legal lever Charles needed to execute this massive wealth redistribution entirely without administrative resistance from his heir. The Prince of Wales had unknowingly provided his own father with the key to lock him out. That's not just a sad irony. That's estate planning conducted at a terrifying level of sophistication that most elite law firms couldn't pull off if you gave them a decade to prepare. The bizarre witnessing ceremony itself is highly worth examining because it reveals exactly how carefully the palace legal team constructed this fortress to withstand absolutely any future challenge. Under strict British law, a sovereign's private will amendment absolutely cannot be witnessed by family members, palace employees, or absolutely anyone who stands to financially benefit from the estate. The witnesses have to be entirely, unimpeachably impartial. So, the palace quietly brought in Dame Sarah Aspen, a highly respected senior High Court judge, Sir John Baker, the esteemed Chancellor of the Diocese of Norwich, and Professor David Starkey, a renowned constitutional historian. 3 prominent people with completely unimpeachable credentials who had absolutely no personal stake in the outcome. All 3 had to be physically present in the exact same room at the exact same time, directly observe the king sign the document, and then immediately sign it themselves in his physical presence to fully satisfy the strict requirements of the Wills Act of 1837. When William furiously entered the room later, holding a printed copy of the amendment's regulations, and angrily demanded an immediate halt, arguing that the reallocation of historical heirlooms strictly required a secondary verification certificate from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the High Court judge coldly informed him that the king had already quietly secured that exact certificate during a highly private audience in London exactly 3 days prior. Every single possible objection had been anticipated. Every procedural challenge had been neutralized completely in advance. The signing itself took less than 3 silent minutes. King Charles entered the room at exactly 20 minutes to 4, leaning heavily on a silver-top walking cane. He did not look at his son. He walked directly to the heavy reading desk, slowly took his glasses from his pocket, sat down, and deliberately dipped his fountain pen into the inkwell. Once he signed his name with finality at the bottom of the 3rd page, the 3 witnesses signed in rapid practice succession. Each signature was immediately accompanied by a physical hot wax impression from the heavy Sandringham state seal. Not a single word was spoken between father and son. The document was instantly locked inside the heavy leather dispatch case and became an active, binding legal covenant the exact moment the last witness finished signing. Immediately after, the internal secure phone system rang with an urgent call from the keeper of the privy purse, reporting that the main accounting terminals in London had automatically, instantly locked down 3 massive overseas investment files containing the vast liquid capital reserves of the Duchy of Lancaster. By aggressively locking these files under a conditional trust amendment, Charles ensured that his successor absolutely cannot access core capital without strictly meeting restrictive management conditions drafted by the Norwich legal team. A physical bank statement shockingly discovered inside a desk drawer revealed that a massive chunk of private offshore wealth had been permanently transferred into a new, independent endowment fund, dedicated exclusively to the maintenance and restoration of historical state apartments at Windsor Castle and Holyrood Palace in Scotland. The private wealth is now permanently legally bound to the physical, literal upkeep of the institution itself. Future monarchs will absolutely have guaranteed funding for roof repairs and stone restoration. They will absolutely not have liquid capital they can redirect for personal purposes or to appease family members. What quickly rippled through the upper echelons of the British legal establishment in the tense days following was a quiet, terrified recognition that an uncrossable line had been permanently breached. The high-end London law firms that specifically specialize in elite estate management understood immediately what this maneuver meant. The palace was absolutely no longer attempting to manage internal family friction through soft public relations campaigns or gentle, off-the-record press briefings or temporary, tactical adjustments. The House of Windsor had decisively chosen to deploy the absolute and unyielding authority of property law to enforce total, undeniable structural compliance and absolute operational silence across every single branch of the family. Among senior advisors and key members of the royal household, a strong consensus formed that while the extreme abruptness and intense secrecy were startling, this was an entirely unavoidable intervention to permanently neutralize persistent instability originating from the California branch. For years, the endless friction caused by external commercial ventures and highly critical public commentary from the younger prince had deeply threatened the long-term stability and dignity of the crown. By firmly choosing to bypass traditional interpersonal negotiations and instead coldly codify strict financial boundaries, Charles provided a definitive, brutal template for handling internal crisis. The entire mindset shifted from viewing this as a messy, emotional family dispute to fundamentally understanding it as a vital defensive consolidation of sovereign resources. The massive transformation in exactly how the monarchy manages its internal relationships is now completely finished. The traditional, soft reliance on spoken understandings and shared family goals has been entirely, permanently replaced by formal, binding trust clauses, strict residency thresholds, and immutable property deeds. Senior advisors and leading constitutional experts observe that the ancient monarchy has aggressively chosen to insulate itself from future volatility by making its foundational wealth legally impervious to external pressures. Individual selfish ambitions will absolutely no longer be allowed to compromise the financial security or historical continuity of the crown. This incredibly systematic approach has also completely redefined the very role of the heir to the throne, firmly positioning the future sovereign primarily as the fierce guardian of a heavily fortified legal architecture, rather than the absolute unquestioned master of a fluid estate. William initially fiercely resisted these changes, viewing them as a direct infringement upon the traditional, unchecked prerogatives of the next in line. But the wider royal establishment overwhelmingly views the harsh outcome through a lens of pragmatic necessity. By securely locking core capital reserves into dedicated maintenance trusts and imposing rigid, unbreakable accountability measures, Charles has ensured that whoever sits on the throne in the coming decades will do so with a guaranteed, unshakable institutional foundation. The massive catch is that this foundation comes heavily equipped with handcuffs. The future king inherits a glittering crown equipped with unyielding legal armor, but he also inherits rigid financial parameters he absolutely cannot alter. For the California household, the long-term implications are absolutely severe and completely irreversible. The massive financial safety net that was likely assumed to be an immutable lifelong birthright has been subjected to a highly aggressive, comprehensive audit, and in the process, the king has permanently installed a trapdoor. The strict 5-year residency threshold means that even if Harry were to completely abandon California, return to the United Kingdom tomorrow, and aggressively re-establish primary residence, the 6 years already spent happily abroad have irreversibly triggered the disqualification clause. There is absolutely no curing period. There is absolutely no grace provision. The dense trust language is absolute, and the draconian non-disclosure mechanism means that any desperate attempt to challenge this legally would brutally expose absolutely every commercial venture of the past 5 years to relentless public scrutiny. Every single partnership agreement, every optimistic revenue projection, every complex tax filing. Palace has effectively, coldly said, accept the new diminished reality in silence, or explain your entire business model under oath to the world. That is absolutely not a choice most people would ever want to make. The aggressive reclassification of heirloom jewelry adds another massive layer of permanence to the strike. Highly valuable items that were understood for decades to be destined for Diana's younger son and his children are now permanently classified as state property housed securely in the Tower of London. The brutal archive copyright transfer means that highly personal descriptions of family life from Harry's own teenage perspective are now permanently, legally controlled by William's office. The massive financial trusts that would have provided lucrative capital distributions at specific age milestones are now entirely conditioned on strict geographic requirements that absolutely cannot be met while living in California. Every single possible pathway back to the massive institutional resources has been systematically, coldly closed, absolutely not through angry letters or messy public statements, but through the quiet, unfeeling machinery of property deeds, trust amendments, and biometric access restrictions. What King Charles has ultimately accomplished, viewed through the incredibly cold, calculating lens of institutional strategy, is an absolute masterclass in preemptive legal defense. He took a painful period of intense internal volatility and deep familial fragmentation and ruthlessly used it as the necessary justification for an emergency constitutional maneuver that will permanently protect the Crown's vast resources for generations. The soft era of flexible boundaries and emotional compromises within the British monarchy definitively ended on that rainy Tuesday afternoon at Sandringham. The harsh new reality is firmly codified, completely ironclad, and entirely immune to the emotional whims of the public square. The House of Windsor now actively operates as a rigid, unfeeling corporation governed entirely by the cold calculus of property law. Future sovereigns will ascend not as free masters of a fluid fortune, but as heavily restricted guardians of a heavily fortified legal architecture designed to endure for centuries. The silent, terrified acceptance that rippled through the plush corridors of power in London confirmed that the ancient rules of engagement had been irrevocably, permanently rewritten. There is absolutely no room left for future dissent, zero space for emotional appeals, and absolutely no mechanism for legal reversal. The harsh path forward for the British monarchy is entirely clear. The institution is absolutely no longer at the mercy of messy personal relationships or shifting family dynamics. It stands heavily protected by an unbreakable legal framework, sovereign, secure, and entirely self-contained. The forgiving era of a soft monarchy is permanently over, and the very first devastating casualties of this new ruthless order are the very expectations of the family members who foolishly sought to operate independently of it.